Bom dia a todos. É com muita alegria que vamos dar início ao nosso evento. Ainda nessa manhã, vamos ouvir agora a palestra do professor Dr. Tadeu Gomes de Oliveira. O professor Tadeu Gomes de Oliveira, ele possui graduação em Ciências Biológicas pela Universidade Federal do Maranhão, com mestrado em Wildlife Ecology and Conservation pela University of Florida e doutorado na mesma área pela Universidade Federal de Minas Gerais. O professor Tadeu, atualmente, é professor assistente da Universidade Estadual do Maranhão e também dos programas de pós-graduação em Ciência Animal e também da Rede Bionorte. É pesquisador assessor científico do Instituto pela Conservação dos Carnívoros Neotropicais, que é o Procarnívoro, e da Provida Brasil. Também é membro bastante atuante do grupo de especialistas em felinos da UCN Cat Specialist Group desde 1995. Ele também integra o grupo de especialistas em pequenos carnívoros da UCN Small Carnivore Specialist Group. Também, tem diversos, também assessora vários comitês de espécies ameaçadas no Brasil. O professor Tadeu tem experiência na área de ecologia e conservação animal, atuando principalmente com felinos neotropicais, outros carnívoros e espécies ameaçadas, além da composição das comunidades de mamíferos, avaliação de status e impacto. Atua em diversas áreas do Brasil, mas especialmente na Amazônia Oriental e Cerrado Norte, além da Caatinga, e em menor escala na Mata Atlântica e no Pampas. O professor Tadeu é um especialista com os carnívoros silvestres, principalmente os felinos, e ele vai nos honrar nesse evento com a palestra intitulada The Little Now Small Cats of Brazil, Reconciling their Science and Conservation Actions. Professor Tadeu, amanhã é sua, que ela seja bastante proveitosa e nós estaremos acompanhando as perguntas para passar ao professor Tadeu. Então, vamos poder dar início.
Bom, obrigado pelo convite e vamos direto ao assunto. Bom, my presentation will be about the little-known small cats of Brazil, reconciling their science and conservation needs. I chose this topic because I think it's about time for us to integrate academia with the real world. It's usually there should be no dichotomy in what we do as researchers and what we can actually bring to improve nature conservation. So that's why I chose this topic. And since the small cats are my main target species, I decided to focus on that. So the whole presentation will be showing how can we do science and apply this science into conservation. Because if we stay only in one realm, if we stay only in academia, publishing papers in very prestigious journals, it doesn't matter because your research might not reflect into conservation action and into conservation needs for your target species. So that's why it is really important for you, for everybody, to try to do this as much as possible. Part of this was because an assessor friend of mine told me once that evaluating proposals on conservation, supposed to be on conservation action, there's pretty much just academic theses being disguised as conservation actions. So that's why I decided to focus on this, to show that we can do deep hard research, and also directed towards conservation, species conservation. Brazil has 9 of the 11 species of neotropical felids within our borders, which means that Brazil holds the most of the range of most of those species, and which means that the country is important for multi-species management and also should be a priority area for conservation action. But the point is, most of the target species we're going to be talking today, the small cats, they are very poorly known, especially not only in their overall natural history stuff, but especially in their demographic stuff, which is badly needed for proper conservation action. So that's what I'm gonna trying to show. Uh, the species, they all have great overlap in distribution, in habitat, in feeding habits, in activity patterns, and body size, which means that they have high potential for interspecific competition, and which is another important topic for conservation that we will not delve too much into, but it should be, we're going to be talking about it in a short while. Here is just a summary for on the red list assessment of both at both the global and national level. The global level at IUCN and at the national level in Brazil. According to IUCN, Brazil has only 2 species that would be considered threatened, both in the vulnerable category, which are the northern tiger cat, Leopardos tigrinus, and the southern tiger cat, Leopardos gutulus. The others are either near threatened or considered of least concern. In Brazil, on the other hand, of the small cats, which means that the cats is smaller than 15 kilos, which means, let's say, uh, small, medium sized cats, all except for the ocelot, Leopardus pardalis, are considered threatened. Most in the vulnerable category, and only the northern tiger cat in the endangered category. These are the species. The biggest one is the ocelot, which is the most common and common for a cat, and also the most abundant. And it's one interesting point because the ocelot exerts a negative impact into the smaller species, which means that where ocelots are abundant, the smaller species tend to be rare or absent altogether. The next one is the margay. The ocelot, is on average 11 kilos, 10 to 11 kilos. The margay is about around 3.5 on average. Small cat. The margay is considered mostly associated to forested habitats. It does occur in the savannas, in the cerrado, but usually within the forest patches of those more open environments. The species is considered near threatened globally and vulnerable in Brazil. The northern tiger cat was split from the southern tiger cat after a paper published in 2013, which showed that the two then subspecies did not intermingle, and they were genetically apart for a considerable amount of time, as large as the amount of time between some of the other cats. So now they are considered 2 separate species. The northern tiger cat in Brazil would occurs uh, on the borders of the Amazon, in eastern Amazonia mostly, uh, and the central north part of the country, mostly in the Cerrado and Caatinga ecosystems. The other, it's about 2.4 kilos on average, 2 to 2.4 kilos. The other one is the southern tiger cat, which was split in 2013. This is a species from the center south part of Brazil. It does inhabits the Atlantic forest domains and part of the Cerrado in the central south part of Brazil. It's also about the same size as the other one, 2 to 2.4 kilos on average. The Jeffries cat is a species that in Brazil is restricted only to Rio Grande do Sul, mostly in the Pampas area of the Rio Grande do Sul state in Brazil. It is about 4 to 4.5 kilos on average. It's a pretty big cat. It is mostly widespread in temperate South America, but not in Brazil. In that for that matter. The Pampas cat group is another group that was about a little more than a month ago proposed to be split into two species. It originally was Leopardos colocola, but now the suggestion is, which has not been accepted worldwide for that matter, but we are considering here them both separately because there is a major conservation issue related to this. The northern pampas cat or the savanna pampas cat would be Leopardos bracatus, which would occur uh, in part of in the Pantanal and Cerrado uh, biomes of Brazil, mostly in central Brazil. As far as I know, it does not venture into the Caatinga or forested domains of the Amazon or the Atlantic rainforest. The other species is the southern pampas cat, Leopardos munoz, which, let's say, it's pretty much on the brink of extinction. This species, this population, a species, whatever it is, actually, it is on the very brink of extinction. There should be no more than a few dozen individuals. I don't think we can get up to. I don't think we don't even get to the hundreds, but only to the tenth of individuals. It is restricted to the Pampas region of Brazil and Uruguay, and a small patch in Argentina. And as I said, and we don't know much about this cat. We're gonna be back. We're gonna be talking about it in a short while. The Pampas cats, they are both about 3.5 kilos of body weight. The Jaguarundi is another intriguing species. It is not spotted. Of the small cats, is the only one that is not spotted, but it can show different color phases. The one you see here is the reddish phase, which is more common in the open areas of the Cerrado and especially the Caatinga. And there's the darker phase, which is kind of from gray to brown, and sometimes gets to blackish, not deep black, but blackish. It's about 5 kilos on average. So, in here, why for species we be say that, well, these species are either vulnerable, threatened, or not threatened. But how do we know? How do we do this? We need to do population assessments. We must have abundance information to do the proper assessment for the red list. So how do we know that this cat is vulnerable, or it is least concern, or it is near threatened, is not actually threatened? We will need science. We will need information. Otherwise, our assessments will not be correct. And this needs to be gathered in the field. In here, we have the example of the savannas of Mirador State Park, which is in here, in the central south part of the Brazilian mid-north in the state of Maranhão, where we did population assessments of the northern tiger cat. Actually, the first one published so far. So those data, those information, population information, let's say, are needed if we want to know what the area requirements of a species are. What's the having information on minimum and maximum pop density, we can assess population size. We can have an idea about how big or how small the population is, and also if it is fragmented or not. Another interesting thing on the conservation point of view, where we will need information as well, is to do the famous PVAs, population viability analysis, or PHVA, population and habitat viability analysis. The software mostly used is Vortex 10, but there are other possibilities as well. But this is interesting because you can make simulations and see if your target species will survive different scenarios, with diseases, with loss of habitat, with culling, with hunting, with poaching, whatever. Where you can have a pretty good assessment on how the population, if it would sustain or not in the short term or the long term. For long term, we're considering only pretty much 1,000 years, which in the evolutionary point of view is not much. But there are limitations. In the short term, it's usually 100 years. Here, I'm showing like a graph presenting density information on all the smaller species of cats found in Brazil, uh, except for the ocelot. I'm considering only the smaller species. I'm considering here the ocelot as a medium-sized cat. So as we see, the densities get from near to zero to up to 0.25, or 25 individuals in 100 square kilometers. Uh, the smallest density we have is 0.001, which means one individual in 1,000 square kilometers. Which means, what is the point here? Just to say that the small cats we have in Brazil, they are pretty much rare everywhere, because the ocelot, for your comparison, reaches on average densities of 0.3, which is above the largest density of the smaller cats. And these densities are from Jaguarundi, Margay, northern and southern tiger cats, and all are from areas where ocelots are either absent or rare. In most areas where ocelots are abundant, the small cats' densities should be smaller than those uh, to the lower values we have here, which means they're extremely rare. Where, in other words, where ocelots are abundant, the small cats are pretty much the area is pretty much useless for them, which is a very important thing. But before saying that, let's get to some density, some population uh, points. The density of the ocelot compared to the density of all the other species of small cats combined were significantly different, the ocelots being smaller. The smaller cats' density in areas where ocelot density is below 10 individuals per square kilometer or are absent was significantly higher than where ocelots were uh, above that threshold. Above 10 ocelots per square kilometer, small cats density drop considerably, which suggests a negative influence of the ocelot on the small cats, on the smaller cats. But not every time we are able to do density estimations, because for that, the science needed is not hard, it's not easy to get sometimes, because cats are rare, they are secretive, and for doing population assessments, you will need a certain number of individuals and of recapturing those individuals. Recapturing in the sense of photographic capture. The first photo is the capture, and the subsequent pictures of the same individual are the recaptures of it. And with that, we can have an idea of the population, of the abundance of the species. If we have enough data, we will be able to have the density estimates that I presented here. If not, we can have at least relative abundance, which are usually done a number of individuals, or because they usually are by themselves, or sometimes mother with cubs. Number of photos or individuals per 100 trap days or trap nights. It doesn't matter. I'm just showing an example of the northern tiger cat in Brazil, and for Jeffrey's cat and Pampas cat in Brazil as well, just to give you guys an idea. So if we don't have population density estimates, but we are, at least we will be able to get relative abundance estimates, and this is important because when you're doing population monitoring, you can have an idea if the population is stable, is increasing, or if it dropped. In this case, it's from one of our study areas in the Caatinga, where we were lucky to be able to get density estimates for both northern tiger cat and the Jaguarundi in 2011 and 2019. And as you can see here on the bars, there was a population drop for tiger cat and also a population drop for Jaguarundis on the same time period. Which, what does this say? It says that in that period of time, there was a considerable population drop for both species. And but why is that important? It is important because for proper red list assessments, nowadays it's required to show a population drop. You have to have the stronger the data you have in your hands, the better your assessment will be. So, just an example for the tiger cat, northern tiger cat in Jaguarundi. And here we just did a map on the expected small cat density in Brazil. As you can see here, the densities are really low in most of the country. In more than 93% of all the area of Brazil where there is still natural habitat, uh, their population, the expected population density of small cats is only, it's below 4 individuals per 100 square kilometers, which is pretty small. Those densities are pretty small. Why? Because usually in most areas, including the protected areas, the ocelot is the dominant species. Where only in 0.0 something percent, the small cats actually reach higher densities. Everywhere else is the densities are usually below 0.08 or 0.04 per square kilometer. Another interesting thing is to see which species are the most abundant where. As you can see here, the ocelot is the dominant species in about 80% of the areas where ocelots are found. It is by far the dominant species. The other cats are in different situation, but this I wanted to point this slide only to show that Jaguarundi, which uh, prior to this current red list assessment, was never considered threatened in Brazil because it is more diurnal and uses open areas, open habitats, let's say, uh, more often than the other species. It is more easily seen. Ocelots, which are not endangered anymore, were considered and threatened at some point, but never ever have jaguarundis been. Only after we had the science to back it up, to show that it doesn't matter if you are able to see jaguarundis. It is just a bias of due to the natural history characteristics of the species, but it's usually the third species ranking in the rank order, which means jaguarundis are not common anywhere. On the contrary, they are pretty much rare. Also, in here, I just want to show the integrating the density stuff with area requirements. Here we have to have a population of about 1,200 cats or 5,000 cats, considering like the conservation of, you know, the long-term or short-term conservation. For ocelots, the ocelots densities would suggest that the area needed for population conservation of ocelots would go from 6,200 to over 100,000 square kilometers. But when we're talking about the smaller cats, we can see that the areas required for that conservation are usually on the the smallest areas needed excuse me, for that conservation. If their population is low, will be is high actually, will be from 20 to 33,000 square kilometers. And if the populations are small, which means, as I shown on the previous map, more than 93% of Brazil, the areas required for long-term viable, genetically viable populations would be over 100,000 square kilometers, which means huge areas, which shows that connectivity is important because we cannot have conservation units by themselves of this size. So this is important. This is just to show how good science can give good info for conservation, for proper conservation. So what is the take-home message of this population stuff that I've been talking about? Where these smaller cats are found in high densities, their density estimates are not higher than 15 to 25 individuals per 100 square kilometers. But where their densities are low, it's usually 5 or less, actually, usually even less than 1 per 100 square kilometers. The ocelot, on the other hand, is usually higher than 30 individuals per 100 square kilometers. And where ocelot density is low, it's usually 10 individuals or less, not 1 per 100 square kilometers, which means that the bigger ocelot could be sometimes 10 times more abundant than the smaller cats. Where the smaller feeders are found in high density, this is repeating itself. Sorry. The area requirements for conservation of the smaller species are larger than for the larger size ocelot. But because of the ocelot effect on the population of the smaller cats, no protected area outside of the Amazon can be considered large enough to support viable populations for long-term conservation of the smaller cats in isolation, which means that small cats conservation is not lies outside protected areas. Why? Because usually in protected areas, ocelots are the most abundant species, are the dominant species, and the most abundant in population sizes that usually leave small numbers of the smaller cats within those units, with very rare exceptions like Mirador State Park, where ocelots are really rare, or Serra do Tabuleiro State Park in Santa Catarina, in the Atlantic Forest Santa Catarina, or Serra dos Órgãos National Park in Rio. Those are areas where ocelots are either absent or in very, very low numbers. And in these areas, margays and northern and southern tiger cats are mostly the most abundant species and get reasonable population sizes in those areas. But usually those areas are not large enough except for Mirador. Ocelot conservation relies on the system of protected areas, whereas the conservation of jaguarundis, margays, northern and southern tiger cats, both Pampas cat and Jeffrey's cat will largely depend on conservation strategies implemented outside protected areas, which means private lands. And with the expansion of the agricultural frontier, this is troublesome for the small cats. In here, I'm going to get some sort of case study that we did recently for Mirador State Park and the population of the northern tiger cat, Leopardos tigrinus there, to show how important to have good science can change the perspective of conservation. Here we have the whole area of the park, which is 5,008 square kilometers in size. 8,000, I mean. 5,008 square kilometers in size. But the study showed that only the dense savannas are used by the northern tiger cat. The species does not inhabit the open savannas uh, that we have here, which means that this white area on the map, which are open savannas, are not suitable for northern tiger cats. But what does it say? Well, it says that only 52.5% of the park has area for northern tiger cats. But if we did not know that northern tiger cats does not live in open savannas, we would expect a population size for Mirador twice as what it actually is. So that's why I said that good science is really needed for proper assessments and conservation uh, information. I mean, tools and proper tools for conservation, because now we know that areas of open savannas are not suitable for northern tiger cats. But we'll get there. I'm gonna show you the outcome in the total population for one area. For Mirador State Park, using two methods of estimating the population, a non-spatial or the traditional, uh, and the spatial population size. We would have, for the whole area of the park, 537, not 1,000 individuals. There would be actually over 1,000 if we did not consider the habitat specificity, or for about 282 individuals, or about 500, considering if we included the whole park. So this is just to say that um, those specificities that some species do have are important when you're doing population assessments of them, because it's usually not a requirement, but is usually population size affects the judgment of the red list assessment. In here, we did an assessment for the conservation units in the Matopiba savannas or the northern savannas, the savannas of the states of Maranhão, Tocantins, Piauí, and Bahia, which means that in this whole area, uh, the protected area population would be about 700 individuals only in the protected areas. And doing the same analysis for this is the Cerrado Biosphere Reserve. In the Cerrado Biosphere Reserve, we also excluded in this area the open savannas, which are not suitable for tiger cats. And considering the an average minimum density and the average density is expected for the areas, we would have population sizes for the whole Cerrado Biosphere Reserve of not much more than 2,000 individuals. What does it say? Well, this is important for northern tiger cats because the Matopiba savanna is pretty much what's left of the savannas of Brazil, because the central savannas are very much fragmented, and the most extensive areas of savannas are found in the Matopiba. But considering the expansion of the soy of the agricultural frontier, we are expecting that only the biosphere reserve will be able to maintain connected viable populations, because we would expect that outside the biosphere reserve population would be highly fragmented or extirpated altogether, which means that for conservation purposes we will have pretty much about 2,000 northern tiger cats, which is not much for conservation. Uh, Here we're not considering only for the Matopiba area. The study also showed the impact of dogs. In the areas we were doing the population assessment, we found 15 dogs at the male site and 7 photographed by our cameras at the Cagadu site. But the important thing is, as you might see here, the pictures showed dermatologic problems in the dogs there, which we also found in the foxes, especially the crab-eating fox in the park. What does it say? It says that whatever diseases the dogs have, they will be bringing them into the areas used by the cats, because 80% of the cameras where we photographed small cats in Mirador also photographed dogs, which means that they are overlapping in area use. And one important point is, although we cannot see distemper, canine distemper virus on camera, but an assessment, a preliminary assessment, showed clinical indications that dogs within the park borders had were having distemper, canine distemper virus, and this virus can wipe out entire populations, and it has actually done that for foxes in Mirador and possibly also for northern tiger cats at one point. In here, we have we consider all the households uh, in the park, and all households in Mirador have small cats. I mean, have domestic dogs. So we did a map, uh, heat map, considering the impact of dogs in the viable habitat for northern tiger cats. Note, please do notice that the areas of open savannas that are also impacted by dogs were not considered in this analysis. The dogs were moving from 8 to 11 kilometers at Cagados, and at the male area from 1.5 to 2.5 kilometers, which means that the considering the average movement area of a movement of dogs from their households, from the nearest households, getting this average for the park where we have settlements, we would expect about that 65% of the park would be impacted by dogs. 60, translating 65% of the habitat available for northern tiger cats in Mirador State Park are impacted by domestic dogs. And this leads us into the population viability analysis, where we did two scenarios in here without any catastrophes in the short and long term, in 100 and 1,000 years. And we also considered loss in carry capacity in another scenario, which is the graphic in the lower part. And in other case, as you can see here, the population would not go extinct. But when we did consider a mild, I'm saying a mild outbreak, the population would sustain. But if the disease outbreak, or if we have loss of habitat, if the disease outbreak is reasonable, the population would go extinct, would not be viable, which is troublesome because Mirador State Park, after this study was conducted, was appointed as the most important area for northern tiger cat conservation in the world, not only in Brazil, but in the entire range of the species. Which means that we have to be really careful about dogs. But what does it say into conservation? What this science that I'm talking here, population size, reflects into conservation? One thing, when we're doing strategies for northern tiger cat conservation, we will have to consider we have to consider habitat specificity, and not only for northern tiger cats, but also for the other cats as well. It showed how important to consider that for better assessment of their populations. The monitoring part to show that the population is dropping, or if the population is increasing, or if it is stable. You don't need the density estimate, but with uh, relative abundance, you can do that. And camera trapping is being used everywhere nowadays. So it's not hard to do population monitoring of the small cats. You just need to do it periodically, and ideally continuously, to see how the population is faring. And also the dogs. It's important for us to assess, now that we know that the risk of disease transmission of free roaming domestic dogs inside conservation units is a major threat, which means that we should start vaccination programs for dogs that are either within or near the borders of protected areas. So it is important because otherwise the population, the small cat population, might be susceptible to disease outbreak, which, as we can see here, are a problem for the small cats. This is just an example for northern tiger cat, but the other species would fare on the same because they're all very much biologically equivalent, similar, and also their natural history is also kind of similar. But in here, and when there is no science, what should we do? This is the case specifically speaking about the southern Pampas tiger cat, which is a Leopardos munoi, which, whether it's a unique evolutionary unit by itself, uh, which is actually a unique evolutionary unit by itself, whether it is a subspecies or a species as we are considering nowadays, we don't have information about it. So how are we going to protect a species that is critically endangered if we don't know pretty much anything about it? So in those cases, what should we do? We need to apply what we know of similar sized species, or what do we know about other pampas cat populations or other pampas cat species. They should be there should be some equivalence among them. So that's what we do. But we need now. We are actually trying to target, gain information that could be used for their conservation because they have very specific habitats in the pampas, which is suggestive that only in areas where you have extensive cattle ranching, cattle raising in the pampas, you will have good habitat for pampas cat. So in that sense, pampas cat are will be beneficiated by cattle in the pampas because cattle grazing makes the habitat less shrubby and more open, which is favored by the species. But nowadays, with intensive cattle ranching and agriculture, uh, most the estimate is that about 80% or more of the habitat available for pampas cat, for the southern pampas cat, is gone. So that's why the population, expected population, by we're expecting like populations of less than 100 individuals in Brazil and less than or about 200 something considering the population in Uruguay, which is not doing much better than the Brazilian population. Uh, Turning science into conservation actions. Well, what I showed you, you guys before, are stuff that could be used for red list assessments, either at the global level or the national level. Threat assessment, in other words, at the global and national level, and also providing management and conservation measures for ICMBio and for the state environmental agencies of either the national level or the state or municipal level in Brazil. Here I'm showing again this table that I showed before because this red list assessment in Brazil was properly done only because we had good conservation, good science to back it up. So we need good science, but the good science should not be restricted to academia. The good science should be brought to the real world for global red list assessments, national red list assessments, and also into conservation action. We need to get what we know to educate the public especially those living where the cats are. And remember, I showed before, the conservation of the small cats will rely in protected in not in protected areas but outside protected areas, because inside protected areas ocelots tend to be the most abundant cat, and where ocelots are abundant, the population size of the smaller cats are pretty small. So this is environmental education that we are doing in the Mirador State Park area. To, we need to bring the science to the public. We also making educational material from what we've been learning to target their conservation. This needs to be done. Most of the audience is in academia, so please do take what you do, what your research outside as well, if possible. We know that we have basic science, but we also have to get science and apply science in the real world, especially if you're talking about conservation, which is my field of expertise. So this is just to show the educational material we did. We could also raise awareness with expositions, with photographic expositions. Well, we brought to two of the largest shopping malls in São Luís to make the public aware that we have endangered species and which species those are. So most people don't know what we have in our backyards. So this is important. We have to raise people awareness towards conservation. And this is just showing some of the stuff we did. And also conservation outreach, which we are using the same photographic expositions, bringing them to schools in the periphery and in main school, and all sort of public school, private school. It doesn't matter. To the bigger audience, we need to get conservation outside. We need to talk about conservation. We need to talk about the species conservation needs, but not only to publish. Oh, the Mirador paper was published in a 3.14 site score for the journal. Wow, great! But if that stays there, if we do not do this, in my point of view, we are failing. We're failing. Nature needs this. Humans have devastated the planet up to a point that we might be getting to the point of no return. The climate is being crazy, and people do not associate this with loss of biodiversity, and it is. And we need to do something. What I showed you, is part of the research and conservation action that we do in our research, in our conservation and research program. Before I was calling it a research and conservation program, but now I call it a conservation and research program, Gatos do Mato Brasil, or Wildcats Brazil, that we are trying to do our best to focus our conservation on the small cats that are usually most of the time more endangered than the big cats, which has most of the attention and the money for conservation. Thank you, obrigado, and I'm open now for any questions. Alana?
Oi, Tadeu. Então, estamos agora abertos às perguntas, com o nosso tempo já bem estourando, já bem limitado. Observando aqui o chat, temos bastante pessoas, temos pessoas da universidade, a Natália a Laura Natália Robaio, que é da Universidade Nacional da Colômbia, que eu estou vendo. A Carla Bittencourt, ela parabeniza você, Tadeu, pelos seus trabalhos, né, pela maravilhosa contribuição que você tem dado à conservação dos felinos silvestres. Ah, deixa eu ver. Eu queria só fazer observar. Estamos aguardando, ainda temos algum tempo, né? Acho que eu vou usar das palavras do professor Francisco hoje. Os alunos estavam muito atentos, esqueceram de fazer as perguntinhas, né?
It might be
Mas
intimidating because of
há vários elogios para o professor e também ao tema apresentado e também ao evento. Como
vocês
sempre, né?
podem fazer as perguntas em português se preferirem. Eu posso
E,
responder em português se quiserem também.
inclusive, só deixando, reafirmando que o nosso evento, ele é um evento que ele é internacional, né? A abrangência dele, nós temos participantes de várias partes do mundo, né, que estão inscritos, e a gente precisa atender a essas pessoas do exterior, também porque essa era a nossa proposta, certo? Mas o professor Tadeu, para aqueles que queiram posteriormente ter uma conversa com o chat, no chat pode mandar que as perguntas que a gente também repassa, vai ficar no YouTube, o professor pode também responder, né? Então a gente vai ter acesso a isso, né? Então, basicamente, aqui as perguntas, não há perguntas, mas sim bastante elogios, Tadeu. E realmente, sua palestra foi maravilhosa, a sua contribuição à ciência, a seu estudo, principalmente no PEN, é muito interessante estudar esses felinos, atender a esse conhecimento que a ciência tanto precisa, a divulgação internacional que seus trabalhos têm, para nós é só fonte de orgulho. E o Ciência Animal, ele tem hoje essa área da preservação, da conservação, da morfofisiologia, que é uma área que ela vem atender exatamente a esses estudos, e também dentro disso nós temos os alunos da biologia, que são alunos que sempre estão bastante contemplados, junto hoje também com a medicina veterinária, com as demais áreas que compõem o programa. Mais algum? O que tem aqui são mais elogios, Tadeu. Muito bom,
Obrigado.
muito interessante, né?
Eu me considero o porta-voz desses gatos, né? A voz que fala por eles. Eles
E
precisam de ter alguma voz, né? Então, minha missão agora é ser essa voz que fala por eles.
acredito que depois da sua apresentação, que você faz toda essa panorâmica e que mostra as várias facetas, tanto na investigação, mas também o outro olhar da prevenção, do que é possível fazer, da conscientização através da educação, da educação ambiental, são elementos. Está chegando aqui uma pergunta, Tadeu. A Suelen Barbosa, ela está perguntando se existe algum monitoramento desses animais no Parque do Mirador com relação às zoonoses, é aquele trabalho, Tadeu, com relação às zoonoses.
Bom, monitoramento não. A gente está fazendo, eu já tenho a pandemia, né, na verdade, que impediu já de ter começado. Mas a gente vai estar fazendo o levantamento das zoonoses presentes nos cães, especialmente nos cães e gatos também, né? Mas principalmente nos cães que habitam a área do mel, do posto do mel no parque. Porque no Cágados não tem habitação humana. Os cachorros que foram encontrados lá, eles vêm de outras áreas. Eles estão se deslocando muito. Então, o que é interessante é que antigamente se achava nas publicações que os cachorros se deslocavam cerca de 2,5 km das casas. Não, eles se deslocam muito mais do que isso. Que foi o que a gente confirmou lá. No mínimo, até 11 quilômetros eles estão andando dentro do parque, levando o que quer que eles carreguem para a população. É mais ou menos como agora na pandemia. Eles estão imunes ou eles vão, mas eles levam a porcariada e está no ambiente. Ele não precisa ter um contato direto, mas o ambiente, com a presença dele, se contamina, e aí contamina as outras espécies de carnívoros que lá existam. Então, a gente vai estar fazendo, mas não como monitoramento, a gente vai estar fazendo, na verdade, o levantamento para isso, para tomar as atitudes. Aí a gente vai estar previsto também um programa de vacinação. A gente quer saber a extensão do problema de doença que tenha nessa população. E aí já dá a medida de contra-ataque, que seria o quê? A vacinação desses animais. E agora isso foi possível graças ao quê? Ao estudo antes. Porque até então a gente achava que não passava na cabeça que doença seria a maior ameaça para esses gatos no parque. E é. E não só no parque. Isso mostra o quê? Que doenças têm um potencial gigantesco de aniquilar populações dessas espécies, que já não chegam a ter números elevados em quase lugar nenhum. E aí, quando a gente está falando, isso não está restrito à espécie A, B ou C. Ataca todas, e não só felinos, todos os carnívoros. Entendeu? Essas doenças, elas são comuns, e a grande maioria delas, as mais graves especialmente, a sinomose e a parvovirose, elas matam. Eu conheci a Covid, na verdade, por conta de gato, de matar a população de gato. Eu não fazia nem ideia que existia coronavírus que afetasse humanos, mas eu já conheço desde os anos 90, quando a metade da população do Zoo de São Paulo foi aniquilada porque tinha gato doméstico na redondeza, não era em contato direto. Aniquilou metade da população do plantel do Zoo de São Paulo, dos gatos selvagens. Entendeu? Então,
Tadeu, poxa, aqui.
Grave.
Chegaram mais perguntas, tá certo? Tem uma, só respondendo para a Sara, a proposta mesmo era o professor falar inglês mesmo, mas ele está respondendo em português as perguntas. A Elisama Medeiros, ela faz uma pergunta. Se é um órgão internacional que faz a lista vermelha, a Red List, temos algum no Brasil que faz isso?
Sim.
Que lista de espécies em extinção? Ela está perguntando sobre a lista vermelha.
Sim, a lista vermelha, quem está à frente da lista vermelha mundial é a IUCN, a União Internacional para a Conservação da Natureza, com a sede em Gland, na Suíça. Ela tem toda uma série de protocolos, e esses protocolos passaram a ser adotados por uma grande maioria dos países, inclusive o Brasil. A lista atual brasileira, que está em vigor hoje, ela foi feita de acordo com esses critérios da IUCN. E a lista que está sendo trabalhada agora, a gente já teve o primeiro round de análises e nós estamos fazendo uma reavaliação delas, porque agora, com a separação de Colo-Colo em duas espécies, em Bracatus e Munoz, a gente vai fazer, porque a população de Munoz é criticamente ameaçada. Provavelmente venha se tornar a espécie de felino mais ameaçada do mundo, não só do Brasil. Entendeu? Então, a situação do bicho é crítica. Então, o mesmo critério da IUCN é utilizado nas listas nacionais e pode também ser feito nas listas estaduais. A gente tinha um projeto chamado Biodiversidade Ameaçada, que o objetivo final dele era fazer a lista vermelha do Maranhão, mas ele foi abortado pelo governo, foi suspenso. Então, esperamos que a gente possa retomar isso para ter listas adequadamente realizadas. Então, a da IUCN, eu fiz parte da elaboração dela. Os dados contribuídos pelo projeto Gato do Mato Brasil ele afetou a avaliação das espécies de todas elas. Entendeu? Então, esse tipo de informação é necessária, porque senão você pode estar considerando ameaçada a espécie que não é e está deixando de fora espécies que são. Entendeu?
Ok.
Então, é importante ter isso.
Temos aqui mais na verdade, um comentário. Eu acho que foi a Sara que postou, mas está com o nome de Gláucia também. Ela faz um comentário da seguinte forma, que precisamos também de ações educativas e preventivas, mas que elas sejam antes das espécies entrarem em risco. Um comentário que ela fez. Então, como medidas preventivas.
Porque, assim, você quando faz educação ambiental, você pode estar até direcionando mais para uma espécie ou outra, ou um grupo, mas, na verdade, isso serve para tudo, acaba servindo para tudo. Então, na verdade, é isso. Se a gente leva isso no dia a dia, nas escolas públicas, particulares, e nas áreas rurais, principalmente, a gente pode ir mudando esse cenário. E pelo menos a médio e longo prazo, eu não diria curto, mas a médio e longo prazo, sim, é o caminho. Educação ambiental é uma necessidade. Não tem programa de conservação que vá para frente e que realmente seja satisfatório e não tenha uma educação ambiental forte por trás.
Certo. Mas, no mais aqui, Tadeu, realmente são os comentários que os alunos fazem, parabenizando a sua palestra, que realmente ela foi excelente, extremamente esclarecedora, de um trabalho de uma relevância muito importante, principalmente para o nosso estado, no estudo, mas que se abrange a todo mundo. Isso é muito bom. Né?
Eu
Então, Tadeu,
agradeço os comentários. Muito obrigado. No que eu puder ajudar, estamos às ordens.
certo, e eu gostaria de te agradecer imensamente por estar aqui conosco, você é parte do Ciência Animal, agradecer a todos aqueles que estiveram conosco ao te ouvir, ao ouvir as palestras, falar que esse evento foi um evento trabalhado com muito carinho para todos, e a gente está muito, todos nós estamos muito satisfeitos, toda a comissão organizadora, a professora Andréia, o Antônio, a Nayara, a gente está realmente tendo um bom êxito. Gostaria de convidá-los para que retomássemos às 14 horas com a palestra da tarde com o doutor Andrei Pereira Lage, da Universidade Federal de Minas Gerais, que será mediada pelo professor Helder de Moraes e que ele vai tratar das doenças infecciosas emergentes. Então, nós agradecemos, vamos para um break de almoço e retornamos às 14 horas. Tadeu, muito obrigado a todos que estiveram conosco. Uma boa manhã, um bom final de manhã.
Boa tarde a todos, obrigado.
Obrigada.